Grant by Ron Chernow. Here's a story that feels almost too cinematic to be true, and yet every word of it is real. Picture a man in the final chapter of his life. Not long ago, he was the most powerful figure in his nation, a triumphant general who'd literally saved the country, a president who'd served 2 full terms. But now, everything has crumbled around him. A smooth-talking young financier dubbed the young Napoleon of finance has wiped him out completely. We're talking about his entire fortune, vanished. Every last dollar. He's 61, barely able to walk after a nasty fall on the ice that kept him bedridden for weeks. Now he's reduced to accepting handouts from strangers just to keep the lights on. For a man who'd carried himself with such dignity, the shame is almost unbearable. But here's where it gets even darker. One summer afternoon, after eating a peach, he feels this strange, searing pain in his throat. For months, he tries to ignore it. You know that feeling when you're afraid to hear what the doctor might say? When he finally goes, the news is devastating. Throat cancer. There's a tumor the size of a baseball growing in his neck. The pain is constant and excruciating. He can barely swallow, even with the opiates that leave his mind foggy. His doctors tell him he has maybe a few months left. So what does this dying man do, knowing he's about to leave his beloved wife with nothing? He does something remarkable. He starts to write. He picks up his pen to tell his life story, to relive those great battles and victories, not for glory or legacy, but simply for survival. There he sits, propped up in a worn leather armchair, legs wrapped in blankets, a shawl draped over his shoulders, writing with an almost frantic urgency. He's pouring his entire life onto these pages, hour after hour, day after day, through sleepless nights and pain that would break most people. He keeps writing. This man, famous for his profound silences, produces over 330,000 words of sharp, beautiful prose in less than a year. He literally holds death at bay through sheer willpower, finishing that final page just 1 week before taking his last breath. That man was Ulysses S. Grant. And the book he created, The Personal Memoirs of U.S. Grant, became one of history's greatest military autobiographies. A genuine literary masterpiece that sold hundreds of thousands of copies and rescued his family from destitution. This story of Grant's last stand is actually the perfect window into his entire life. It's a life bursting with contradictions. A man who couldn't stand the sight of blood who became an unstoppable warrior. A quiet, modest guy from the Ohio frontier who ended up commanding over 1 million soldiers and leading a nation. Someone many dismissed as simple, even a failure and a drunk, who possessed a deep strategic genius and a moral compass that few truly understood. Today we're diving into that extraordinary life, guided by Ron Chernow's monumental biography, Grant. This isn't just about a general or a president. It's a story about comebacks, not just once, but again and again. By the time we're done, you'll understand the secret behind Grant's quiet strength, the source of his resilience when faced with failure, and you'll see why this unassuming man from America's heartland deserves to stand alongside Washington and Lincoln as one of our greatest heroes. This is about the hidden greatness that can live inside the most ordinary-seeming people, just waiting for the right moment to shine through. The story of Ulysses S. Grant doesn't start on some epic battlefield. It begins in a cramped little cabin in Point Pleasant, Ohio, where a baby boy entered the world so quietly and unobtrusively that his parents almost didn't notice the strength brewing inside him. His father, Jesse Root Grant, was the complete opposite: loud, boastful, endlessly ambitious, a tanner who was always scheming for his next opportunity. One neighbor sneered that Jesse would follow $1 to hell. Jesse was haunted by his own father's failures, a man who'd turned to drinking and squandered everything. and he was absolutely determined that his eldest son would succeed where his father had failed. But young Ulysses took after his mother. Hannah Simpson Grant was quiet, deeply religious, and incredibly reserved. She rarely laughed, never raised her voice, and you'd never catch her bragging about anything. She possessed this immense inner strength and self-control, and that's where Ulysses got his defining traits: his modesty, his calm presence, and that almost impenetrable silence. This created an odd family dynamic. While his father constantly pushed him, urging him to perform and show off his talents, Ulysses would just retreat into this shell of quiet stubbornness, a kind of passive resistance that would shape his character for life. He learned early on to keep his feelings locked away, buried deep beneath a calm surface. The one place this quiet boy truly came alive was on horseback. Put him on a horse, and he was completely transformed, graceful, fearless, totally in command. He could tame the wildest horses, not through force, but with this gentle sensitivity, almost like he could read their minds. It was actually the perfect metaphor for how he'd later lead people, not through brute force, but through quiet, intuitive mastery. But in the world of men, especially in his father's blood-stained tannery, he felt like a complete failure. He hated everything about the work, the awful stench of animal hides, the blood. Here was this gentle soul who couldn't stand the sight of blood, which is pretty ironic for a future general. He finally told his father he'd do the work until he turned 21, but not a single day longer. Seeing that his son had zero future in the tanning business, Jesse Grant, in a stroke of practical brilliance, secured him an appointment at the United States Military Academy at West Point. It was a free education, a path to a respectable career. Ulysses didn't want to go. He worried he'd fail the entrance exams, that he just wasn't cut out for military life. But his father insisted, and Ulysses, as always, quietly went along with it. At West Point, a bureaucratic mix-up by a congressman changed his name forever. Born Hiram Ulysses Grant, he was mistakenly nominated as Ulysses S. Grant. His new initials, U.S., quickly earned him the nickname Uncle Sam from his fellow cadets, though his closest friends just called him Sam for the rest of his life. West Point wasn't exactly where Grant shone like a star. He was a decent but unremarkable student, excelling only in mathematics and, no surprise here, horsemanship. His equestrian skills were legendary. He actually set a high-jump record that stood for decades, but military tactics? Not so much. He secretly dreamed of becoming a math professor. He was quiet, reserved, often seeming lost in his own thoughts. Yet his classmates saw something in him. They respected his honesty, his integrity, that quiet determination. One of them, James Longstreet, who he'd later face across the battlefield, remembered his girlish modesty, but also his thoroughness in accomplishing whatever task was assigned him. After graduating, he was assigned not to the cavalry which he'd hoped for, but to the infantry, and posted to Jefferson Barracks near St. Louis, Missouri. That's where everything changed for him. He went to visit the family of his old West Point roommate, Fred Dent, at their plantation called Whitehaven. And there, he met Fred's sister, Julia. Julia Dent was vibrant, vivacious, full of life. Basically everything the quiet, reserved Ulysses wasn't. She wasn't conventionally beautiful. She had strabismus, a lazy eye that made her self-conscious her whole life. But to Grant, she was absolutely perfect. For the first time, he found someone he could share his inner world with, someone who saw through his shyness to the strength and humor underneath. It was, as he later said, love at first sight. And Julia was completely enchanted by this small man with the large epaulets. She became the first person to truly believe in him, more than he believed in himself, and her faith would become the foundation of his entire life. Their courtship got interrupted by the outbreak of the Mexican-American War in 1846. Deep down, Grant believed this war was unjust, an imperialist adventure designed to expand slavery. He later wrote that he saw it as, quote, one of the most unjust wars ever waged by a stronger nation against a weaker one. But he was a soldier, bound by duty, so he went. The Mexican War became Grant's trial by fire. He first witnessed the true horror of combat there, seeing a man's head blown clean off by a cannonball at the Battle of Palo Alto. But he also discovered something strange about himself. Under fire, he was unnaturally calm. The chaos of battle seemed to sharpen his focus, bringing this odd clarity. He served as a regimental quartermaster. Sounds dull, right? But it taught him the vital, unglamorous work of keeping an army supplied, a skill that would prove absolutely invaluable later. He watched and learned from two very different generals. The rough, down-to-earth Zachary Taylor, whom he admired, and the vain but strategically brilliant Winfield Scott. He also fought alongside an entire generation of men who'd become his allies and enemies in the Civil War: Robert E. Lee, James Longstreet, William Tecumseh Sherman, and George H. Thomas, among others. After 4 long years apart, he finally married his beloved Julia in 1848. But Army life was brutal. He got shuffled from one bleak, isolated frontier post to another, from dreary Sackett's Harbor in New York to the remote wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. The pay was terrible, and he was desperately lonely without Julia and their 2 young sons, Fred and Buck. It was during these years of isolation, boredom, and professional frustration that an old demon came back to haunt him: his struggle with alcohol. Grant was what we'd call a binge drinker today. He could go months without touching a drop, but when he did drink, especially when he was lonely and had nothing to do, he underwent this radical personality change and couldn't stop. It was like a forbidden impulse, a source of deep shame for a man who otherwise had incredible self-control. He even joined a temperance lodge, the Sons of Temperance, trying to conquer it. But the rumors followed him everywhere. His career stalled. At Fort Humboldt in California, under a tyrannical officer named Robert Buchanan, who'd harassed him before at Jefferson Barracks, Grant's drinking led to a final confrontation. Faced with choosing between a court-martial or resignation, Grant chose to resign. He couldn't bear the thought of his wife and family learning about his public disgrace. In 1854, at just 32 years old, Captain Ulysses S. Grant left the Army. His military career seemed over. He was a failure in his own eyes and the world's. What came next were what he called the 7 lean years. He went back to Missouri and tried making it as a farmer on land Julia's father had given them. He built a log cabin with his own hands, naming it, rather ironically, Hardscrabble. He worked tirelessly, cutting wood and hauling it into St. Louis to sell on street corners, wearing his old army coat to stay warm. Friends from his Army days would spot him, this West Point graduate, this Mexican War veteran, looking poor and defeated, and they'd ask in disbelief, "Great God, Grant, what are you doing?" "I'm solving the problem of poverty," he'd reply. But he couldn't solve it. The farm failed. He tried being a rent collector, but he was too soft-hearted to actually evict poor tenants. He even pawned his watch just to buy Christmas presents for his kids. Finally, completely humiliated, he had to accept a job as a clerk in his father's leather goods store in Galena, Illinois, working under his 2 younger brothers. He was 38 years old, a man who'd commanded troops in battle, now reduced to adding up figures in a ledger. He was quiet, unremarkable, someone people in town barely noticed. He seemed destined to spend the rest of his days in obscurity, just another forgotten guy whose youthful promise had fizzled into nothing. And then, in April 1861, a cannon fired on Fort Sumter, and the nation plunged into civil war. For Ulysses S. Grant, the sound of that cannon was the sound of resurrection. The war that would tear the country apart became the very thing that saved him. Whatever my political opinions may have been before, he wrote to his staunchly pro-slavery father-in-law, I have but one sentiment now. We have a government, laws, and a flag, and they must all be sustained. There are but two parties now, traitors and patriots, and I want to be ranked with the latter. He was one of the few men in his small Illinois town with actual military experience, and people immediately called on him to drill the local volunteers. But he wanted more. He knew he was capable of more. He went to the state capitol in Springfield hoping for a command, but got overlooked, just a forgotten man in a shabby coat. Dejected and about to head home, the governor, desperate for competent officers, appointed him colonel of a rowdy, undisciplined regiment called the 21st Illinois. And here's where the transformation was immediate and stunning. The quiet store clerk became a true commander of men. He imposed discipline not through yelling or punishment, but with this quiet, firm authority that the men instantly respected. He marched them across the state, turning them into a tough, disciplined fighting force. By August 1861, through the political connections of his local congressman, Elihu Washburn, he was promoted to brigadier general. Grant's genius for war wasn't about flashy brilliance or complex theories. It was a genius of simplicity, focus, and relentless, bulldog tenacity. His philosophy was straightforward. The art of war is simple enough. Find out where your enemy is, get at him as soon as you can, strike him as hard as you can, and keep moving on. While other Union generals, like the notoriously cautious George B. McClellan, obsessed over elaborate preparations and worried endlessly about what Robert E. Lee might do, Grant focused only on what he was going to do to the enemy. His first major test came in February 1862 at Forts Henry and Donelson in Tennessee, two key Confederate strongholds controlling the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. In a swift operation with naval gunboats, Grant captured Fort Henry easily. At Fort Donelson, after a much tougher fight, the Confederate commander asked for surrender terms. Grant's reply became legendary, electrifying the North and earning him a new nickname. No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted, quote. He wrote, Ulysses S. Grant was now Unconditional Surrender Grant, the North's first real war hero. But the war was about to teach him a brutal lesson. In April, at a place called Pittsburgh Landing near a small church named Shiloh, his army got caught in a surprise Confederate attack under Albert Sidney Johnston. The first day of Shiloh was a disaster for the Union. Grant's men were driven back, thousands were killed or wounded, and it looked like his army might collapse completely. Any other general probably would have retreated. But Grant was different. As darkness fell over a field of unimaginable carnage, with wounded men screaming in the rain, Grant met with his friend and most trusted officer, William Tecumseh Sherman. Well, Grant, Sherman said, we've had the devil's own day, haven't we? Yes, Grant replied calmly, chewing on a cigar. Lick 'em tomorrow, though. And he did exactly that. Reinforced overnight, Grant launched a fierce counterattack at dawn and drove the Confederates off the field. Shiloh was a victory, but a horrifying one. The 24,000 casualties were more than all of America's previous wars combined. The battle sobered Grant deeply. He realized now that this wouldn't be a short, glorious war. "I gave up all idea of saving the Union except by complete conquest," he later wrote. The gentle man who hated blood now understood that only relentless, brutal force would bring peace. The victory that should have made him famous almost destroyed his career instead. The Northern press, hungry for someone to blame for the shocking casualties, turned on Grant. They accused him of being surprised, incompetent, and, here we go again, drunk. Those old rumors came roaring back. For a while, his career hung by a thread. But one man never lost faith in him: President Abraham Lincoln. When a group of politicians came to the White House demanding Grant's removal, Lincoln listened patiently and then said simply, "I can't spare this man. He fights." And fight he did. The Vicksburg Campaign in spring 1863 was his masterpiece, a campaign that military historians still study today for its brilliance and bold risk-taking. For months his army had been stuck in the swamps and bayous north of the heavily fortified city of Vicksburg, the Confederate Gibraltar of the West on the Mississippi River. Every attempt to take it had failed. Finally, Grant decided on a plan of breathtaking audacity. He'd march his army down the west bank of the Mississippi, ferry them across south of Vicksburg, and attack the city from behind, cutting himself off from his supply lines and living off the enemy's land. It was such a risky gamble that even his most trusted officer, Sherman, thought it was crazy. But it worked beautifully. For 3 weeks, Grant's army marched through the heart of Mississippi, fighting and winning 5 battles, confusing and scattering Confederate forces, before finally laying siege to Vicksburg itself. On July 4, 1863, after a 47-day siege, the city surrendered. It was a true turning point of the war. With Vicksburg captured, the Union now controlled the entire Mississippi River, splitting the Confederacy in two. The day before, Lee had been defeated at Gettysburg. These twin victories marked the beginning of the end for the South. Grant's star was rising fast now. That fall, he was sent to Chattanooga, Tennessee, where a Union army was trapped and starving. In a series of brilliant battles, he broke the siege and drove the Confederates out of the state. Lincoln had found his general. In March 1864, Grant was promoted to lieutenant general, a rank previously held only by George Washington, and given command of all Union armies. He came east to face the man who'd become a living legend, the seemingly invincible Robert E. Lee. The war's final, bloodiest chapter was about to begin. Grant's plan was simple and brutal: launch a coordinated attack on all fronts, preventing the Confederates from shifting reinforcements. He'd attach himself to the Army of the Potomac and personally go after Lee, while Sherman marched through Georgia, destroying the South's ability to wage war. Grant's strategy wasn't about capturing Richmond. It was about destroying Lee's army. "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer," he famously declared. What followed was the Overland Campaign, 40 days of the most savage, relentless fighting the war had ever seen. The Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, Cold Harbor, these names became a roll call of slaughter. In just 1 month, Grant's army suffered 60,000 casualties, a number that horrified the North and earned him the grim nickname, the Butcher. But here's the thing. For every man Grant lost, he could get a replacement. Lee couldn't, and Grant never turned back. After every bloody battle, instead of retreating like his predecessors had done, he always moved south, always pressed forward, always closed in on Lee. Finally, he trapped Lee's army in a 9-month siege at Petersburg, just south of Richmond. While the armies were locked in trench warfare, Sherman captured Atlanta and then began his devastating march to the sea, cutting a path of destruction across Georgia. By spring 1865, the Confederacy was collapsing. On April 2nd, Grant broke through Lee's lines at Petersburg, forcing Richmond's evacuation. For one final, desperate week, he pursued Lee's starving, ragged army across Virginia. The end came on April 9, 1865, in the small village of Appomattox Courthouse. The two great generals met in the parlor of a private home. Lee stood tall and immaculate in his dress uniform. Grant was shorter, slouched, mud-splattered, not even wearing his sword. There was no gloating, no triumph in Grant's manner. He felt sad and depressed, he later wrote, at the fall of a foe who had fought so long and valiantly. He offered Lee surrender terms, so generous they stunned the Confederate general. Southern soldiers would be paroled and allowed to go home. They could even keep their horses, Grant said, so they could put in a crop to carry themselves and their families through the next winter. The war was over. Grant returned to Washington a hero, the savior of the Union. But just 5 days after Appomattox, the nation was thrown into mourning by Abraham Lincoln's assassination. The massive task of healing the fractured nation, of Reconstruction, would now fall to a new president, Andrew Johnson, with Grant as commanding general at his side. The presidency turned out to be a different kind of battlefield, one Grant wasn't really prepared for. Elected in 1868 on a wave of popular acclaim, he came to the office with a soldier's desire for peace and order. "Let us have peace," his campaign slogan, became his administration's motto. But peace proved elusive. His 2 terms brought both noble victories and heartbreaking failures. His greatest achievement was his courageous, determined fight against the Ku Klux Klan. When white supremacist terrorists in the South waged a campaign of murder and intimidation against newly freed African Americans, Grant didn't hesitate. He declared war on the Klan, using federal power to crush them, sending troops south and prosecuting thousands of Klansmen. He oversaw the ratification of the 15th Amendment, guaranteeing voting rights for black men, and for a brief, shining moment it seemed like the Civil War's promise might actually be fulfilled. But his presidency also got plagued by scandal. Grant himself was impeccably honest, but he was also naive, too trusting of the people he appointed to high positions. He had a serious blind spot when it came to friends and allies, and he was surrounded by a new breed of politician, men who saw public service not as a duty, but as a chance for personal enrichment. The Gilded Age scandals, the whiskey ring, corruption in his cabinet, tarnished both his reputation and his administration's legacy. When he left the White House in 1877, he was exhausted by politics. He and Julia took off on a 2-year world tour, where he was hailed as a hero everywhere from London to Tokyo. He got treated like royalty, a living symbol of American democracy and strength. He came home to a hero's welcome, and for a while it seemed he might even run for an unprecedented 3rd term. But that moment had passed. His time was over. And then came the final, cruel twist. The collapse of Grant and Ward, financial ruin, poverty, and the cancer. It was in this final battle, racing against death to write his memoirs, that the true measure of the man revealed itself once more. The same quiet determination, the same uncomplaining courage, the same iron will that had carried him through the wilderness and the siege of Vicksburg now carried him through his last days. He died a hero, not just for what he'd done on the battlefield, but for what he'd endured, and for the simple, profound dignity with which he faced the end. As Walt Whitman wrote, he was one of the greatest heroes, a plain man from the heartland who'd shouldered the weight of a nation and, in the end, saved it. When we look back on Ulysses S. Grant's life, what lessons really resonate for someone today, maybe a young person standing at the threshold of their own journey? I think the first, and maybe most powerful lesson, is about the nature of failure itself. Before the Civil War, by almost any standard, Grant was a complete failure. He'd failed as a soldier, as a farmer, as a businessman. He was in his late 30s, working as a clerk for his younger brothers, staring at a future that looked pretty bleak and unpromising. And yet, within 4 years, he was commanding all the Union armies. Within 7 years, he was President of the United States. Grant's life is this powerful reminder that your story's first chapter doesn't have to be its last. Your past doesn't define your future. What defined Grant wasn't his failures. It was how he responded to them. He never gave in to despair. He endured. He persevered. He had this quiet, stubborn resilience that was way more powerful than any loud boast or grand ambition. He just kept going. And when his moment finally came, he was ready. We're so often terrified of failure, seeing it as some kind of endpoint. Grant's life teaches us it can actually be a beginning, the crucible where our true strength gets forged. The second big lesson is about the nature of strength itself. Grant wasn't what we typically picture when we think of a great leader. He wasn't tall and commanding like Lincoln. He wasn't dashing and brilliant like Lee. He was short, a bit stooped, quiet, and unassuming. He hated giving speeches. He was awkward in social situations. But his strength was different. It was an inner strength, a quiet confidence, an unshakable calm right in the middle of chaos. While other generals were panicking, Grant was thinking. While others were paralyzed by fear of what the enemy might do, Grant stayed focused only on what he would do. His strength wasn't in his presence, it was in his purpose. It's worth remembering in a world that so often mistakes noise for substance and charisma for character. True strength is often quiet. And finally, there's this surprising and genuinely inspiring story about Grant and civil rights. For most of his life, Grant wasn't an abolitionist. He grew up in a border state, married into a slave-holding family, and for a time even owned a slave himself. But the war transformed him. He witnessed firsthand the evil of slavery and the courage of African American soldiers fighting for their own freedom. And as president, he became their greatest champion. At a time when the nation was exhausted by conflict and wanted to forget the promises it had made to its newest citizens, Grant held firm. He waged war against the Ku Klux Klan, a war that was unpopular and politically risky, but one he believed was his moral duty. He fought for the right of black men to vote, hold office, and live in peace. His record on racial equality, as Ron Chernow points out, was the most progressive of any president between Lincoln and Lyndon B. Johnson. In a time of great moral cowardice, Grant showed tremendous moral courage. He teaches us that we're not prisoners of our past, that we can grow and change, and that our conscience can be our truest guide. So what can you actually take from Grant's life today? First, embrace your hardscrabble moments. Those times of struggle, when you feel like you're failing, they're not the end of your story. They're where you build the resilience you'll need for the great challenges ahead. Second, cultivate your own quiet strength. You don't have to be the loudest voice in the room to be the strongest. Focus on your purpose, do the work, and let your actions speak for themselves. And finally, be a champion for those who have no champion. Stand up for what's right, even when it's unpopular, even when it's hard. That's the true measure of a hero. That's the enduring legacy of Ulysses S. Grant. That was a summary of Grant by Ron Chernow. We've certainly covered the major moments of his life today, but I have to be honest, a summary can only ever be a map. The real treasure is found when you explore the territory yourself. The true power of a book like this lies in those quiet moments when a particular story or simple phrase connects with you in an unexpected way. This journey we took today is meant to help you decide if this man's life is one you want to explore further. If anything we've talked about has sparked your curiosity or resonated with your own struggles and ambitions, I really encourage you to grab a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning history. It's an experience that can genuinely change how you think about failure, strength, and the quiet power of a determined heart. The link to the book is in the description. Also, if you found this summary valuable, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support lets us continue these deep dives into the books that have shaped leaders and changed the world. Let's keep learning and growing together. I'll see you next time as we pull another life-changing book from the billionaire's bookshelf.